And so now we've got to do the same thing again. It's very boring to have to do it, but on this much larger international stage.
Huge.
Again, it's not a very large number of people, but the consequence of the frauds perpetrated by this small number of people, and then covered for by these wretches who are paid by the extremist advocacy groups, the Greenpeaces and so forth, to bully and destroy the reputations of anyone who stands up and gives the other side of the case in public, whether it be at a university or a newspaper or on the BBC. The lefties are there, and they come in from these, and they're paid to do it. They monitor those of us who are most effective in their assessment in speaking out against this lie, and they will then endlessly try to trash our reputations. Now, those people, in doing that, are not committing fraud. Unfortunately, it'd be nice to be able to stop them, but they're not committing fraud. What they are doing is providing cover for the people who are committing fraud. This would have been stopped a long time ago had it not been for this, frankly, fascist technique, which was first worked out by Goebbels, then it was used by the disinformation directorate of the KGB under Ion Mihai Pacepa. They adopted it, and from them it entered into the communist way of thinking. And now that's the routine method the hard left use if they have a particular project or person or thing like climate change that they want only one view to prevail on. It could be homosexuality, it could be abortion, any of the things the left are excited about. They do this, and they screech and hammer away at the reputations of anyone who dares to suggest there might be another point of view, until they silence all public opposition to what they're saying. Yeah. That's what they've done with the climate change thing. It's not that there aren't, I should think by now, an overwhelming majority of the scientific community must have realized that the rate of global warming is just nothing like what was predicted. They must have begun to understand this. They can't have not seen this, but they dare not say it, because if they do, in comes Greenpeace, in comes these paid trolls on the websites, these paid people who go onto TV and just slag them off and call them names and say they're paid by big fossil fuel interests. I only wish if somebody from the fossil fuel interests would pay me, it would make my life a great deal easier. Nobody pays me a dime.
Yeah.
And that's how it is on our side of the debate, because the other side have so terrified the fossil fuel companies or others who might otherwise want people like me to argue their case for them, that they won't come near us. They won't any longer defend themselves. They're all turning up their toes and just falling over. And this is a great shame. And so we've decided, how do we deal with this problem of the left having organised, they've got control of the news media, they've silenced virtually all debate on this subject, and yet they're still not winning that debate, and that's the interesting thing. It's just like the fascists in Germany, just like the communists in Russia. So the green I call them the Fasmunists, the combination of fascist and communist. They have their crony capitalist side, but they're essentially anti-capitalist. But these Fasmunists, these extremists, they are losing this debate. They can't understand it, because they've spent, goodness knows how many hundreds of millions now on pursuing this nonsense, these green groups. And they can't understand why the general public is just not buying it. Because every opinion poll shows the public isn't buying it. And what they haven't really appreciated, this is the thing the left has a problem generally, is they do not understand that there may be a distinction between the party line and the truth.
Yeah.
To them, once the party has declared what the party line is, that becomes the truth.
Yeah.
And the very concept of a truth outside the party line is literally impossible for them to imagine. They haven't had the kind of education that allows them to evaluate truth or falsehood by rational methods. And I came across this very interestingly when I was at Churchill College, Cambridge, a few weeks ago, and I preached a sermon in the college chapel. And I took 4 subjects on which the politically correct point of view has shut down all debate. And if you dare to say some of the things I'm going to say now, the shrieking becomes unbelievable from all directions. And I said the church has a role in making sure that freedom of speech and of academic research and publication in these areas is maintained and is not suppressed because of some left-wing party line. And I said I'm going to take 4 examples. And I took homosexuality as the first one. And I said, here is a very interesting case where the church has long taught that homosexuality is wrong. Indeed, in its exploitative form, it's one of the 4 wrongest sins you can commit. Why is this? Because it does harm. How does it do harm? It does harm to its practitioners, because it makes them ill and it makes them die 10 or 20 years before their time. In that respect, it's about twice as bad as smoking. It kills its practitioners. Now, how often have you seen that fact reported in any mainstream news medium ever?
Oh, I haven't.
No, well, it is the fact. And so I said it's not for us, therefore, to say that homosexuality should be banned any more than we should say that smoking should be banned. But what we should surely do, as we do with smoking, is to put a health warning on the packet. If you turn up and you want to have a so-called gay, so-called marriage ceremony, then you should be given a health warning. You should be told that promiscuous homosexuality carries with it a very large risk of disease and death, and that therefore staying close to one partner only, which is what the only pretext I can see for having a homosexual marriage would be, is something they've really got to stick to, because of course your average homosexual marriage lasts 1 year, whereas the average heterosexual one lasts 14 years. So they need this warning against promiscuity, just for their own protection, so that they know that the lifestyle they're getting into is, medically speaking, dangerous.
Surely they know that. They need to be told that.
They don't know it. That's a lot of innocent people get drawn into this, not having the faintest idea. They may find out by the time they've already been drawn in. It's a bit late by then. They'll have caught whatever ghastly diseases they're going to get, and they'll end up dead 10 or 20 years before their time. That's the tragedy of it. And so I said, the church has a role in saying, look, our teaching on homosexuality is not some arbitrary theocratic teaching from some obscure reason. The reason why the church says homosexuality is wrong is that it kills people. And therefore, we should not have the left silencing these facts. We should allow the facts to be reported openly and fairly. But I'm not arguing for any form of discrimination. Just simply, let's give the folk the facts, so that before they get drawn into this, they are given the warnings that this could be dangerous to them.
It would be interesting.
Education in school, then you should say that homosexuality has far more dangers than heterosexuality. Heterosexuality is the way we're designed to operate, and therefore there are quite strong and reasonably effective barriers against the transmission of infection. But in homosexuality, this isn't the case, and you are therefore much more likely, really many, many times more likely to contract various kinds of disease, including HIV, by homosexual intercourse than by heterosexual. In fact, the latest figures from the Centers for Disease Control are that you're 100 times more likely to contract HIV if you are a promiscuous homosexual than if you are a heterosexual. Now, that's just one of the 4 topics I said, and I said I'm not arguing for any form of discrimination. I'm arguing simply that these facts, and they are facts, should be made known to homosexuals at those points where they interact with the state. When they go to the VD clinics to be treated, they should be given these warnings. When they go for so-called gay, so-called marriage, they should be given these warnings, so that at least the state has done to them the same duty as it does to potential or actual smokers. It says, look guys, this is dangerous, it is bad for you. And just leave that, and that's all the state's role should really be, in my view, in all of this. So I said that, and you could have heard a pin drop, because they were so furious. These were undergraduates who were supposed to be being trained in hearing ideas, some of which they might not find welcome. They froze. I knew then that I'd got them. I knew that this is how they probably would react. I didn't think it would be quite as intense as it was. So then I thought, well, I'll dig myself in further. And I went on to abortion. And I said the problem with abortion is that it too kills people, but it tortures them before it kills them. Because a lot of these little kids in the womb, when they're torn limb from limb and pulled out in bits, they aren't given their own anaesthetic first. And if they are relatively mid-term to late-term abortions, they will have a sufficiently developed nervous system to be aware and in acute agony as they are torn to pieces. And I said it as bluntly as that. I said, this is well established. You can actually see it on the scans as they shrink away from the invasion, the sort of vacuum tube they shove in as the first step in this process. And you can see the kid shrinking away and then shrieking with pain as it is torn limb from limb. They know this. They've seen these scans, these doctors, and they still don't give the child its own anaesthetic, and no law around the world that allows abortion requires them to do so. Why not? Because the moment you start treating these little children as little children, and you go to the trouble of giving them an injection of anaesthetic so they don't feel the pain, it concentrates your mind as the brutal abortionist on what you're doing. And they know also it concentrates society's mind on what is really going on here. And they know they would lose the debate if they were made to have to do that. And so they resist it and they shriek like mad. And I said, little children are being tortured. And we think that Dr. Mengele and the things he did to children was terrible. We are doing more terrible things than that every day in every public hospital throughout the Western world. And I said, the church cannot, and the Catholic Church does not, remain silent in the face of this appalling torture as well as the slaughter. And again I said, you may have one view or another on whether abortion should be allowed. I said, to me as a simple Catholic, the words thou shalt not kill don't require that much interpretation. But, all right, you might want to interpret it in a different way. But surely you would agree with me that we should take that little inexpensive step just to make sure that the child that is to be torn limb from limb is properly anaesthetised first. They hated that too. Absolute fury. You could see them quivering with rage. These are surely not inhumane. I mean, this is the kind of thing the church ought to be speaking out about. And then I said, let's take Islam. And you can see it by now, they were really angry. I said, right, we'll take Islam.
So you're preparing them.
When the Charlie Hebdo massacre happened, I said, 19 people were gunned down by these two Muslim brothers who'd broken in. And everybody went around saying, Je suis Charlie Hebdo, etc., etc. But did you notice that not a single news medium published any of the cartoons? And I said, if I had been editor at that time, I would have rung all the other editors and said, we've each got to take one of the least offensive of these cartoons and publish it. And say, this is what it's all about. So that the terrorists would know that the effect of their going and gunning down these hapless victims was actually to spread the very cartoons that they'd hoped their terrorism would suppress. In fact, the terrorism worked, because terrorism actually does work. And the editors instead found a wonderful variety of excuses. It's terribly funny if you go back and look through the archives of what they said about why they weren't going to publish any of these cartoons. And all of it, when it boiled down to the fact we're just scared witless. We dare not do this in case they come into our office and do to us what they did to them. And I said that kind of cowardice in the face of terrorism is why terrorism works. But I said where the church really had a role in this whole debate is not so much in telling the editors to do the job that editors should have done, would have done in my day, but they're a craven lot now. I said what they should certainly have done is to point out to their readers or listeners or audience that one or two of those cartoons were indeed outrageously, intentionally, deliberately, maliciously offensive. And anyone who has any sort of common feeling, fellow feeling for his fellow man of a different religion, and we must all try to maintain that, despite the Muslim terrorists doing their best to make it difficult for us to maintain this civil approach, we should try. We should have spoken out and said that some of these cartoons did go well beyond what is reasonable when you're talking about somebody else's religion. I'm not going to describe these cartoons, but they were quite appalling. And most people didn't realise that some of these cartoons
I never saw them.
Gratuitous. No, you wouldn't, you see, because this was never properly gone into. And I said, if we're ever to find common ground with the Muslims and stop this futile argument between East and West, we have to learn to sympathise with them when they deserve to be sympathised with, as they do in this particular instance. And the fact that some Muslims are killing hundreds of thousands of Syrian Christians and driving them out of their country. I said, of course we should speak out on that, but we should also, when the Muslims themselves are being wrongly treated by our people, we should have the guts to say so and to put in place mechanisms to prevent them from being mistreated again. And I said, of course, the law that used to do that was the blasphemy law, that if you had a religion and somebody came and spat on your religion very publicly and very humiliatingly, you could go to court to stop them. And it gave you some protection from an unbridled and unreasonable exercise of freedom of speech. Now, of course, blasphemy laws can be used to suppress religious dissent, so one has to be careful how you frame them. But the idea of giving people of religion some protection against those who would attack their beliefs, whether from other religions or from none, that's not a stupid idea. And I said the church should be arguing for a reconsideration of the question whether we need blasphemy laws to stop gratuitously offensive conduct towards other faiths, whether it be Muslims or people of no faith. There's got to be some kind of restraint, or freedom of speech can't really work at all. And they didn't like that. And, really quite extraordinary. I didn't like any of this. And so then I ended with the climate change one, which is where now you see it in its context. And I said the church should not take a view on whether or not global warming caused by us is a scientific problem, or even an economic one. That is not the business of Holy Mother Church. Her business, instead, is to make sure that all sides in that debate are fairly heard and that no legitimate point of view is artificially suppressed by the state or its agents. I said if the church does have a role to uphold freedom of speech, because it has seen in the recent history of Europe, both in the east and in the west of Europe, that where freedom of speech was suppressed, tens of millions ended up, in fact hundreds of millions, ended up getting killed.
Yeah. Freedom
of speech is a necessary defense against the kind of tyranny that becomes so overweening that it starts killing people in large numbers for disagreeing with it. And the church must, by now, historically, I said, have learnt this lesson. And it must speak out and defend the climate skeptics against those who would silence them, imprison them, or even kill them.
Yeah.
Because these demands are being made every day. And so far, only one churchman has had anything to say about that, and that was the previous Pope, who said that it was not acceptable that scientists who had a dissenting view on this question should not be allowed to pursue their research, and it was still more unacceptable that scientists who took a different view should be threatened with imprisonment or even death.
But just recently...
President Pope, of course, is completely in the other direction.
Yes.
And I said I thought he was wrong to be in the other direction. He should have been much more careful and more nuanced, as the previous Pope was. And so that, of course, made them even more angry. And I went back to Cambridge a couple of weeks ago to go to a meeting on the climate at the mathematics department. And the following morning I actually gave my own seminar in the mathematics department on the mathematics of climate sensitivity. And I had a couple of the world's most eminent scientists sitting in the audience. They were fascinated because they'd heard none of this before. But anyway, I went to Cambridge and they were still talking all over the university about this particular sermon. And I had had no idea, because that's 30 or 40 people in the congregation, but they'd gone and talked to their mates and had gone all over the university. This horrible man had come and said things about homosexuality and abortion and climate change. And you can't even talk about these issues except to parrot the party line. And these are the universities at which freedom of speech, freedom of thinking, freedom of academic research, it was supposed to be encouraged. And it has gone. And it's gone. I mean, I sat there in the climate change meeting. I suppose about 200 people were there. And I raised one or two questions. And one of them I happened to let slip. I said, well, actually, we have to be careful not to try to claim that the science on a question such as how our effect on the climate will operate is settled, because, of course, it isn't and can't be by its nature. There were boos and hisses from right round the room.
Wow, yeah.
The idea that this might not be settled was something you could not express. And this is how far it's gone. And that's why I bring this back to the question of a fraud prosecution, because the moment one or two of these people are behind bars, then all those folk who are so busy telling us the science is settled, they'll all run for cover in case it happens to them. And suddenly they'll realise that there's not only a moral duty to tell the truth on these matters, there is a legal duty too. And if they don't tell the truth from now on, they could get nicked, they could get sent to prison, then this nonsense will stop.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Excellent.
So I'm quite encouraged. I'm quite encouraged by what's happened in Paris. I think the fact that we got that secession clause in, the fact that even the rest of the treaty is a pretty milk and water thing, it means that they know that this was their last chance to achieve something they haven't achieved very much. There are get-out clauses all the way through it, and slidey bits where the countries who don't want to play will effectively not have to play. China is more or less totally exempted. India has made it plain it's not going to pay any attention. Big countries like that who are between them going to be the world's largest emitter. China already is. India's catching up slowly, but I think with increasing rapidity from now on. And the fact is, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere liberated by us is going to increase and continue to increase, I think, throughout this century. Regardless of what the West does to shut itself down and kick itself in the teeth and damage its economy deliberately. The anti-capitalists, of course, laughing all the way to the bank, because not only are they doing this to our economy and we're doing it to ourselves, we're paying them large amounts of money in various kinds of subsidy while they destroy our economy. And it's, for them, it's an absolute dream ticket. But a couple of well-targeted fraud prosecutions will bring this whole thing to a very sudden stop. And so I'm quite encouraged that the committee did agree to this. There was a certain amount of muttering to start with about, we mustn't go around making public accusations, and so it's being done relatively quietly. And we will be just quietly researching the people we think have committed frauds to find out whether, when you marshal the evidence properly, a jury might be more likely than not to convict. That's the test. But of course, we don't even have to pass that test in order to report to the police. All we have to establish is that on the face of things, there may be a case.
Yeah.
And on that, we now have half a dozen reasonably serious cases in our sights where we think we will be able to identify individuals and universities who have knowingly participated in deliberate deceptions, either for the sake of making money for themselves or for imposing costs and losses on the general taxpayer and user of energy. Those people are now going to have to watch out, because we are coming after them. Some of them already know who we are. The police in 3 countries are already involved. And slowly this will grow to the point where within the police authorities it attains a critical mass, and they realise it's not going away, and they can't simply go on looking the other way because it's politically expedient to do so. In the end, their job is to prevent fraud. It's one of the nastiest of crimes because of the amount of hurt it can do. And so if we come up with good evidence that these frauds are linked, they're part of a system of fraud, which is being operated by these 24 people who are closely in touch with one another and are peddling this and pushing it, then I think we may be able to bring this whole nonsense to a stop. It's collapsing anyway. The fact that there's been no global warming now for getting on for 19 years on the 2 satellite measures, this is a very good indication that the predictions were wrong. The fact that the sea ice in the Arctic is still there, even in the high summer, sort of September time.
And growing.
And, well, you can't really say it's growing much. I think it's still down quite a bit on where it was in 1979 when they started monitoring it. But, of course, if you go back to the early 70s, which is when they really began monitoring it, it was much lower then than it was in 79. There was a big local peak in 79. And then it's fallen since then. But the fall since the early 70s is much less.
Yeah.
And that's something you don't often see reported anywhere. And the moment one looks at any of these various statistics about which they speak with such enormous confidence, one finds that they're essentially making stuff up just about everywhere in this whole climate sphere. And I think the reason why they've got away with it, apart from the fact they terrorize everybody so that nobody dares to speak out and say the opposite, is that they've been doing this for so long on these other matters, homosexuality, abortion, etc. They have already got used to the idea of imposing a scientifically illiterate and damaging, but politically so-called correct point of view, and forcing that on the academic community, on the business community, and on the political community, bureaucratic community, and the media community. They've already become accustomed to doing this and silencing debate on so many areas, is why I've taken some trouble over these 4 areas today. And my intention in explaining in these 4 areas is not to outrage those who are watching, because what is outrageous about saying we would like to save the lives of those homosexuals who, by being dragged into this before they find out it's damaging to them, end up dead 10 or 20 years before their time, or suffering from lifelong diseases that they can't cure. These things could be prevented, perhaps, if they'd been told, you need to know the risks before you start, just as you're told with smoking.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't we give them the same warning? Same with abortion. Why shouldn't we protect the little ones from being tortured while they're being killed? Personally, I would rather stop abortion altogether, but at least let's get what we can achieve and stop the little ones being tortured. And these are not unreasonable or unfair or unkind points. Likewise, we'd rather not have lies told about the climate, because the cost of that in human lives is very large. I want to end on this particular point, because it's a very important one. I'm just beginning to get into some research on how many people are ending up dead in poorer countries each year because they don't have electricity. There is a direct correlation between CO2 emissions and longevity. The more the CO2 emissions per head the population emits, the longer they live. And I think that's largely to do with whether they have electricity or not. And if they don't have electricity, then they are being killed before their time, because they don't have X-rays, they don't have heating, they don't have air conditioning, whatever it might be. And so the attempt by the international anti-capitalist hard left to destroy the coal industry in particular, because it was always the big funder of the conservative and anti-left political parties worldwide, it always has been. This campaign against the coal industry, which is really what this is about, it's purely party political, is having the effect of killing. My current estimate, which I've got to refine, is that somewhere between 10 and 20 million people a year are now dying before their time, because had it not been for the global warming scare, then we would have made sure they all had coal-fired electricity, which is the one form of electricity they can work, because it's low-tech, relatively low-tech. I mean, the modern ones are slightly smarter, but it's still much more low-tech than nuclear power, say, much more reliable than wind or solar, and much less demanding in terms of maintenance and replacement. So it's a much more ideal technology for giving electricity to poorer countries, and the only reason why they're not getting it now is because the international hard left are opposing it. So this policy of so-called no-regrets climate policy, it's actually killing 10 to 20 million people a year. And when you think that the Nazis managed to kill, I think, 75 million in total over the Second World War and the campaign against the Jews, and the communists have killed 150 million, and the environmental socialists killed 50 million with their ban on DDT, just at the point where malaria was about to be extinguished altogether. Now we've got the latest group of environmental socialists, and they're killing 20 million a year. And within another decade, they will have succeeded in killing more people than the communists, the fascists, and the previous environmental socialists added together. That's how serious this is.
Yeah.
Nobody is saying any of this.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
I want you to define for me the word terrorism, because you've mentioned it quite a bit here in this interview, and I think that we need to get... I actually looked up the word terrorism. I actually remember seeing a documentary by a filmmaker, and he actually went to the United Nations and he asked some UN honcho there, what is the official definition of the word terrorism according to the UN, and he said that they don't have one.
No, they wouldn't. The UN doesn't really care about terrorism.
So, but for the sake of if we can, because that word just gets thrown around, but I don't think people really understand what it really means in its purest form, and how the governments are using it, people are using it, and so that people can sort of like, I mean, okay, Islam, radical, jihadist Islam is terrorism. That somehow it goes easily, but there's other forms of terrorism. So give me your definition of what you feel the word terrorism means, so that we can get a grasp on it.
Terrorism is the organized killing of innocent civilians by groups independent of any state, though sometimes funded and supported by them, for motives which are not generally subscribed to by the general population against whom the terrorist acts are being perpetrated.
Okay.
I think that's a reasonably exact definition, and that's certainly.
I don't know what it would be, but just let's have a debate on this word.
If you get groups who are raising funds, whether by covert or legitimate means, whether by corrupt or legitimate means, where they're getting weapons or bombs of various kinds and they're going around blowing people up, that is terrorism, and people have a pretty good idea of what it is when they see it. And of course, the old saying is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and don't you accept that against some regimes the only thing that works is terrorism. I mean, you could argue that, for instance, the French resistance, who were almost entirely communists to do this, the one good thing the communists ever did was the French resistance. They went around blowing things up and they did kill Nazis, but there was a war going on and they were being occupied, their country was being occupied by an alien power. And so they were, in blowing up the Germans, they were carrying on the war. And so that, I would say, doesn't come under the definition of terrorism. Whereas the so-called Irish, so-called Republican, so-called army, they were none of the three. They were like the Holy Roman Empire or the Lord Privy Seal. None of the words applied. They were terrorists, pure and simple. They were running the drugs trade in Dublin and elsewhere. They were running every sort of corruption. That was how they were paying for what they did. They were terrorizing their own population. They were not representative of the Irish population, and they went round killing Irishmen who disagreed with them, and they tried to kill British soldiers as well in Northern Ireland. That was terrorism. And you've got, of course, the various PLO and Hamas terrorists in Israel, and you have terrorists in Africa, Islamic terrorists just about everywhere, and it's probably fair to say that somewhere between 85 and 95% of all acts of terrorism, as I have just defined it, over the past 25 years, were committed in the name of Allah. And so one of the things that the Muslims need to do is to be much more vigorous in speaking out against and distancing themselves from the mad mullahs who are preaching terrorism and those who are practicing it. And the Muslim community has not been as vigorous as I would like to see it being in speaking out against those who are committing very nearly all the terrorist acts in the world of today in the name of the God in whom they believe.
Yeah.
They need to raise their game and distance themselves from the terrorists, because the one thing that the Islamic terrorists are very definitely doing is damaging Islam itself in the eyes of the rest of the world.
Because of the division that they have between the Sunnis and the Shia. And look what happened in Saudi Arabia like a few days ago. That's not a very good development.
Well, the execution of a Shia cleric by a Sunni regime was politically inept, regardless of the rights and wrongs. Politically, staggeringly inept, and an indication of the arrogance and remoteness of so many of these theocratic regimes in the Middle East, where they're not subject to any sort of democratic input, and therefore they will act arbitrarily, capriciously in killing people they disagree with, in funding terrorist movements. A lot of these terrorist movements are funded from Saudi Arabia. That's where bin Laden's family came from. That's where a lot of his money came from. And the Saudis have played a very clever game, keeping in touch with the West, because we're so fascinated by the amount of money they can throw in our direction for various business contracts, etc., etc. And so they have had a far freer ride than, in my view, they should have had, given that they, through the Wahhabist madrasas that they have set up right across the Islamic crescent from the Middle East all the way across to Pakistan, these Wahhabist madrasas preach extremism, and the only thing you'll actually learn in them as a school kid, because they're Islamic school, is how to recite the Quran.
Yeah.
And that's all they're taught, mindless recitation of the Quran. And they're not taught mathematics or politics or anything, they're just taught the Quran. And the Quran, unfortunately, is a very violent book, and if all they do to you is teach you to recite it, you end up thinking the way the Quran wants you to think, which is to go around blowing people up, because that's what it says. It says, if you find them, then kill them. The unbeliever. It's the way that the supposed holy book of Islam attacks the non-believer. Every page, there is some uncomplimentary reference, sometimes of the most vicious kind.
Yes.
And violence against the unbeliever is openly advocated in several places. And although, of course, thank goodness, most Muslims have enough common sense not to put into practice what their book preaches, it is nevertheless unfortunate that the process of ijtihad, or theological interpretation of the Quran, ceased in the 10th century, and they haven't since maintained a proper discussion of what these passages that were written in the 6th century and in the context of the 6th century mean when applied to the 21st century, many centuries later. And this isn't being done. As a result, the crudity with which a lot of these passages are interpreted is quite frightening, and that is, of course, the justification, rightly or wrongly, for the terrorist acts that are perpetrated by all these different Islamic terrorist groups.
Yeah. All right, well, that was a very long interview, and I enjoyed listening to you and talking with you, so thank you once again for your time, and we hope to have another interview soon, and get some of the people that are on the Lord Monckton YouTube channel well informed and well in advance of what's happening with all the things that you are pursuing, and I just want to thank you for your time. I really do, because it's I know you're a very busy man, and you travel the world educating and doing so much good, and I appreciate every minute of your time, sir. So we thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It is good to get the chance to go into some of these ideas in rather more depth, and as I've done this time, to put them in the context of how the hard left, these intolerant and illiberal people, have been shutting down debate in the West on subject after subject: homosexuality, abortion, Islam, climate change, issue after issue after issue. It is no longer permissible even to suggest there might be a point of view other than the party line.
Yeah.
Now, the West was not built on that kind of intolerance. It was built on the destruction of that kind of intolerance. When we had the church killing other factions and vice versa during the religious wars in Britain in the late Middle Ages and the early Tudor and Stuart period, that was a bad thing. All real scholarship virtually came to a standstill during that period. There were a few isolated instances where it survived, but it became rare. And it's only when you shut down intolerance, we have to be intolerant of intolerance.
Yeah.
And we have to say to the intolerant left, we will not be silenced. We will point out that homosexuals are more likely to die than heterosexuals. We will point out that abortion tortures the little children before it kills them. We will point out that the climate is not changing as fast as they had, for self-serving reasons, tried to predict, and nor is it likely at all to do so. And even if it were, it would still be far cheaper to let it happen and adapt to its consequences than to try to prevent it now. We will not be silenced. And once the left understands this, once they understand the huge strategic mistake that they made by taking this climate issue as their number one issue, an issue on which it's not just a matter of the moral niceties, it's the matter of fact. The fact is they made predictions on the basis of which they got this scare going. Those predictions were excessive by a very large margin. And that raises the question whether those predictions were based on any sound science at all. It is now known that they were not. And they must not try any longer to silence us when we point these things out. The fact that they have done so is going to be remembered as, year by year, the discrepancy between what they predicted and the very little warming that I expect to happen increases. And people will remember that it was the left that tried to shut down debate on this. Then they'll notice the debate has already shut down debate on many other issues. And that's why even in what should have been a tolerant academic intellectual atmosphere, namely a college chapel at Cambridge of all places, what I was faced with was the most extraordinary and unpleasant intolerance when the points that I made, which I've made all of them already on the air here, you will see these were reasonable points. They were lovingly made. They were not preaching hatred against anyone.
Yeah.
And they were factual. I can back up every statistic and tell you where I got it from. And yet they found it intolerable that these subjects were even raised.
Yeah.
And this is, and it's, as I say, weeks later, it's still being talked about throughout the university. So horrified were they. This is at one level a measure of the success of the hard left in shutting down debate. This began, of course, with Nazi Germany. Then, as I say, the Russians after the Second World War with Lysenkoism and with Ion Mihai Pacepa's boys at the Disinformation Directorate. They carried on this tradition of vilifying and attacking anyone who disagreed with them. And it was through Pacepa's lot that they managed to get this ingrained into Western leftism, so that the BBC will only give one view on climate change, and has rewritten its own editorial guidelines to say we are entitled to give only one view on climate change because there's a consensus. The fact that there isn't a consensus is neither here nor there. And it's this institutionalization of intolerance that is the hallmark of the hard left. And it is increasingly being spoken out against. When I went to Copenhagen and said some of this, journalists were coming up to me and saying, you're the only person that's ever tried to say that it is totalitarians behind this, and they're trying to silence debate and stifle all dissent. You know, why are you the only person saying this? Is this telling us something about you? I said, no, it's telling us something about everybody else. I'm saying things like I see them, and I'm not frightened of the vilification I will get for saying what I say, but somebody has to speak out to maintain the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of action that we in the West were once used to, and we are now rapidly losing it to this new organized intolerance that is called political correctness. And it isn't political, it isn't correct. It is just a vicious unwillingness and illiberal unwillingness to hear both sides. Well, one of the fundamental principles of natural justice that goes back to Magna Carta is that both sides should be fairly heard. Audiatur et altera pars is the Latin. And this is something which the left would now deny. They would say there's a party line and that is the only side that's permitted. Well, they're going to be remembered for this, remembered with distaste and displeasure by future generations. And the left, by adopting this climate issue as their number one issue, are going to bring down the entire structure of the left, because people are going to see this growing divergence between what they've been predicting and what is happening. They're going to notice that every time an extreme weather event happens, we had a lot of flooding in England again this year, and immediately everybody comes out, oh, this is all to do with climate change. You know, that very simplistic Prime Minister we have at the moment said it's all to do with climate change. No, it isn't. How can I prove that to you? There's been no global warming for 18 years and 9 months. So the one thing we know didn't cause the floods was climate change.
Yeah.
But these people have bought into this leftist nonsense, but the ordinary people are increasingly rejecting it. And this is where the left are now becoming worried. They've begun to realize that this emphasis on climate change is doing them real damage. That there is now a political advantage to the opponents of the left in standing out and saying, oh, come off it, climate change is basically nonsense.
Yeah.
And this is what UKIP, on my advice, did in the 2010 general election, has pursued ever since. Because we did some private polling, and we said, if we started to come out and say this is all rubbish, can we say so? They said that change of policy would get us more votes than any other of the changes of policy we tried to test it against. That was the most popular one. People are so fed up with this climate nonsense, and they're waiting for someone to stand up and speak in their favour. So I think the great thing that we now have to our advantage is that it isn't happening as they said it would. We knew it wasn't going to, but now we can show that it actually hasn't happened as they said it would. And this means that people are no longer fooled. And in the long run, and it will be the long run, this will take 10 or 20 years, the international left is going to suffer, I think, terminally, as a result of the intolerance it has tried to enforce upon all of us. People are getting really tired of this. More and more people are now coming out. I've had just 3 sent by email to me today from different parts of the world. People complaining exactly as I do against the intolerance and illiberality of the left in refusing to allow any proper debate on this issue. That is now a concern which I was the first to raise internationally. It's now being very widely raised, and that's a very good sign. It means the left are beginning to lose this one big time. And in the end, political parties that are not of the left are going to start ganging up against the left and changing their constitutions in such a way that the left will never again be allowed to suppress the truth on questions such as the climate. And this is where this whole fraud thing chimes in with that. It is to say to the left, we are not going to allow you to take over and then shut down debate on, shall we say, DDT, one of the earliest ones where they did this. They banned DDT, and the annual malaria deaths were down to 50,000, and we were about to wipe out malaria. Another few years of DDT and it would have gone. They banned DDT worldwide. Malaria deaths go up to 1 million a year, and they're still not far short of 1 million a year now. And that's 50 years of it. So they've killed 50 million children, mostly children who die of malaria. And they could have been saved if DDT had continued to be used for interior spraying. Now, if you use it outside, it loses its effectiveness, but you do it inside, it's very effective against the mosquitoes. And they banned it on no decent scientific case, and they killed 50 million and counting. You know, it's 1 million a year added to that tally. And so when HIV came along, the obvious thing to do was to test everyone, identify those who've got it, say to them, look, you have got it, you need to isolate yourself as far as you can from intimate contact with anybody else who hasn't got it. So please be careful, because otherwise you'll spread it.
Yep.
They didn't do it. Result, there's now, I've just got the figures from the States, there's 1.2 million people in the States infected over the last 25 years, 30 years. Terrifying numbers, and of course that spreads because the disease isn't being controlled. And of course in sub-Saharan Africa, goodness knows how many. I think even the UN, which has desperately tried to undercount the number of people killed by HIV, admits it's getting on for 40 million. And all of those, virtually all of those deaths could have been prevented if the right public health measures, the standard public health measures, to prevent a new and fatal infection had been taken at the time when they were first advocated, again by the likes of me, who did it solely on the basis of the facts.
Yeah.
So if you don't do this, a lot of people will end up quite unnecessarily dead. And the politicians simply didn't dare, because again the left began shrieking because the homosexuals were worried this would lead to discrimination against them, and so the left insisted on not doing anything about HIV, and that's now killing 1 million a year. And then you've got the refusal to allow coal-fired electricity to be given to the third world, maybe 10, maybe 20 million a year, being killed by left-wing intolerance. And we have not, until now, as my lovely wife said this to me over Christmas, said, you have not been active enough in putting across the moral case against these climate lies. She said, you really got to explain that the left are killing people, and some of them are intentionally killing people. They're saying it's a great idea that we should kill people. And they are killing people in their tens of millions, and you're not saying so. And she said, you know, next time you're together, you make sure you say that. You end with that. You rub it in. You say, these people, by getting the science wrong and being careless as to whether they get it right, and by making up stuff about the climate, they are killing people in their tens of millions every year. Say that and rub it in. And then eventually the left will run for cover because they will realize that we have the moral high ground and they don't.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Well, it's been a great pleasure as always, Paul. Give my love to Paras and all the troops. And I hope to be down in Australia. I don't know when. Nobody's asked me. I come if I'm asked. So if you want to put together a speaking tour, I'll gladly come and a nice tour around Australia would be very pleasant.
Yes, I'm sure you. I know you like Australia, so you're not exactly. I know you're fond of the place. So thank you so much, Christopher, and we'll talk again soon.
All the best.
Cheers.